Okay, students, welcome back. Welcome back to another Star Tutors live lesson. I am Chase. If you're watching the live stream today, welcome back. We'll guide you through the final installment of our SAT Reading Passages series. So we'll be discussing that here in just a second. Today we're going to be finalizing the science passages. There's typically 2 science passages on the SAT reading section. So we'll again be discussing that. If you are part of the live stream, part of the live lesson today, please just say hello or give us a thumbs up in the live chat. You can also give us a thumbs up below the video if you don't want to participate in the chat. And if you're watching the recorded video, all of our live streams are always available immediately after the live stream is done as a recording. If you're watching the recording video, you can always post comments and questions below in the video comment section, and we'll of course answer those or answer as many as we can. All right, guys, so again, welcome back. For everybody in the live chat, welcome here. Guys, yeah, great. Okay, great. Everybody looks like they're coming back here. Is it Mio or Mayo? I'm seeing the live chat. 1460 is unbelievable. We'll talk about that here in a second. The science passages on the SAT reading section are incredibly important. The SAT reading section is, in my opinion, it's easily the hardest section on the SAT. I would say 85 to 90% of our students feel that way. So again, if you guys are getting in there, this is such an important part of your ability to adapt, because the other 3 sections, the writing and language and the 2 math sections, you can practice those concepts, right? You can get better and better at those concepts, so we can always continue to practice those, but the reading section is so much more about comprehension. Okay? So, guys, let's talk about this, okay? We're going to jump in again. It's the SAT reading section, specifically discussing the SAT reading science passages. So let me pull that up on the screen. Before we get going here, actually before we get started, please make sure, guys, that you have downloaded StarU. Can everybody give me a thumbs up in the chat or a thumbs up below the video if you've downloaded StarU? It's our free SAT and ACT tutoring app. It's written and edited. All of the lesson chapters, there's over 100 free lesson chapters, 500 free practice problems. Everything we discussed in this video can be found in much more detail, written detail, within the StarU app. So you click Lessons and Practice Problems, SAT at the top, then SAT Reading. And the comments, right, yesterday we talked a lot about it, but direct and evidence-based questions. You can go read all of those questions right here. Okay, and then when there's practice questions that are appropriate, we give you practice questions that are specific to that type of question choice. So everything we discuss in these videos, you'll find in the StarU app in more detail. So I highly encourage you guys to download that. And again, let us know if you have any questions on that front. All right, so like I was saying before, today we're going to talk about the final installment or the final passage type when it comes to the SAT reading section. If you haven't seen our previous 2 videos, we have made videos already about the passage, about the narrative passage, and about the history and social science passages. Today we're going to be focused on the natural science passages or the science passages. Sometimes it can be debated, I guess, if it's really natural science. But typically, and like I've said in the previous 2 videos, the science passages are typically passages 3 and 5. Okay, 3 and 5. I don't think, as I've quoted before, I don't think the SAT has actually said that those will always be the science passages. But I haven't seen an example where they are not. So again, this is passage number 3 is typically science, and passage number 5 is typically science. Okay? And these are very important passages. In fact, in terms of what we've talked about already for the narrative and the history passages, the science passages are probably the easiest to teach. Okay, and it's my opinion, it's not always the case, but I would say again, 95% of students, and this may be you, if you're going to reorder your passages, we talked about this during the history passage lesson, and again, you can find everything that I'm mentioning in terms of these tutorials, you can find in our SAT reading playlist. In fact, let me post that real quick in the live chat. You guys can find this in the SAT reading playlist, which again discusses in even further detail everything that I'm discussing now. but it's we have real-time videos, we have specific question type videos, so I highly encourage everybody to check this out. CT. Okay, so I just posted that in the live chat. If you're watching the recording, you should still see the live chat replay on the side, so you should be able to see that. I highly encourage you guys to check that out. But when I mentioned yesterday in terms of ordering your passages, it is my opinion, and I'd say this is true of 90%, 95% of all students that we work with, that the science passages need to be done. And the trick is that passage number 5, so frequently we see students, right, skip passage number 5. Right, or don't not skip it, but they have to rush. Right, give it 2 thumbs up if that's you. If you are in reading and you're on passage number 5 and you're rushing to get that one done, in my opinion, that cannot happen. Okay, because what I want to remind you of is that the science passages are typically the hardest to read. Not always. There's a argument can be made on some of those history passages, but depending on how much you love science, it's the hardest read, but it's the easiest questions. Okay, it's the hardest read, but in my opinion, it's by far the easiest questions. And the reason for that is just because you'd expect on a science essay, right? All of these are just 5-paragraph, 10-paragraph essays. What you'd expect is that these questions are very direct, right? Very direct and very straightforward, right? They never change. And so the argument from students that we always get is, well, I don't really like to read the science passage. Well, I don't know what to tell you. In that situation, guys, you can't that can't be the excuse. Especially if you've previously messaged us and said, like, I want to get a 1400. If you want to get a 1400, then it's, again, my opinion that you should get to all of the science passages and skip a different one. Can everybody say I understand in the live chat, or give a thumbs up below the video if you don't want to participate in the chat, that you need to skip a different passage. This is true for 90% of our students, that you need to make sure that you have plenty of time not rushing through passage number 5. Okay, and passage number 3 is that way as well. I think the science passages tend to be a little bit easier. Okay, because if you can get through the reading part, the questions are very, very straightforward. And that's so critical, right? You don't want to be, right? You don't want to be rushing. Okay, you don't want to be rushing through questions that you would otherwise definitely get right, but you're just rushing through those because you're running low on time. That's where I said yesterday that it's very critical that you guys come up with your, remember I wrote this, or this, and I say yesterday, I mean that we filmed the history videos yesterday, but if you're watching the recording, when you look at our history tutorial, talking about the history passages, I mentioned at the end of that video that you should all really come up with a data table that represents how fast you're going through each passage and how accurate you are on those passages, right? Number 1 is always the narrative passage. This was the history/social science. This was the natural science passage for 3. Again, history, social science typically for 4, and then natural science for 5. My guess is that many of you are going to sit there in your practice, if you come up with this data table and you take a full reading test this way, where you stop and start after each passage to get your accurate timing for that passage and your accuracy for that passage. My guess is that you are going to eliminate one of these 2 passages, either number 2 or number 4, because it's the one where you are the least accurate and that it takes you the longest to do. And in doing that, by just simply saying in your mind, now this is not something everybody always gets worried, like, oh, how am I going to remember to do that in the real test? Guys, it's difficult to remember to do that if you've never done it before, but I guarantee, right, you guys are all really smart. I guarantee that if you sit there for just one practice test and you commit in your mind that you're not going to do passage number 4, you're going to skip that one, you're only going to do it if you have time at the end, and if you don't, that's fine, right? But you're going to do passage number 4, passage number 2, you're going to do that one last, right? If you recognize that and you do it for just one practice test, it's not going to be that hard to do it on the real test. Of course, it's going to be difficult if we've never practiced before, but this is a very, very simple task, right? It's literally going 1, 2, 3, and then remembering, okay, I'm not doing 4, I'm flipping to 5. And if you review that for 15 minutes and then you apply it on a practice reading section, you'll be able to do it on the real test. It's not that hard, right? To move on from one passage and just do these slightly out of order. But having said that, again, when we look at these natural science passages, all of the questions, if you can get through the reading, all of the questions are very direct and very straightforward. And that just continues to go along with everything we've discussed with the SAT in general. They are not trying to trick you. Yes, when we say trick, that would be a deliberate attempt to say something. If they make a math problem a little bit more wordy, that's not trying to trick you. That's seeing if you can extract the necessary information, which is something that you're going to have to do in college, right? If they give you a difficult reading passage, they're going to be harder when you get to college. So it's not that difficult in relation to what you're going to see in the future. And so we just cannot come up with the excuse anymore of I just am not that interested. If the reading text is hard, if you're recognizing that it's hard, then maybe that's a passage that you need to skip. But if it's hard, right? If it's harder language, if you're an international student and they give you old English, right, from like pre-1900, that's very difficult. And I get that, and I applauded all of the international students earlier for just how difficult that would be if English wasn't your first language. But that just means that you've got to skip that passage. Because for everybody here, the science passage is not very difficult in terms of the language. Okay, so that's the first thing that I want you guys to see. Again, guys, can everybody I want to make sure that I address this for everybody on the cameras. Can everybody say I understand or thumbs up in the chat? That is, what we just talked about there is so critical in terms of how you're going to approach this test, right? And how you're going to strategize so that the moment that you sit down for the SAT reading section, which is difficult in itself because it's the first section, but the moment that you sit down, you know exactly what you're about to do. There is no anxiety towards things that you can control. Okay, let me just, and I'm going to highlight this in a second, what I mean by these easy questions. Okay, what I mean by these easy questions is that the science passage, the reading itself is difficult for everybody. So even if you're an international student, for American students, it's still difficult because nobody's ever heard of, very few of you have ever heard of these science experiments. Okay, so let me give you an example, right? If we come back here for a second, I'm looking at passage number 3 on the October 20, so again, passage 3 and 5 are typically the natural science passages or the science passages, P3 and P5. Okay, and I'm looking at, this is from the October 2021 US test form. And what you guys will see is that the content is difficult not because of the language, but because of the experiment itself. There's not very many of us who have, detailed, there's probably a few of you that are watching this, but very, very few have detailed animal behavior researchers that have defined teaching as behavior targeted only as naive observers, right? Not many of us have thought about that concept before. But what you'll notice is that the vocabulary within the natural science passages relate far more towards science concepts than they do towards difficult vocabulary like you might see on the history passages. So if you look at something like, right, difficult and dangerous prey or self-sufficient, okay, provisioned by older groups, right, those might be difficult vocabulary words, but because you don't know them, but that's just relation to the science experiment and largely on the science section, which is very different from the history passages and the narrative passages for that matter. The science section has far fewer questions that are very detailed about a hard vocabulary word that you can't figure out. So let me give you an example of this. Okay, so if we go down to the questions now, and I say, as used in line 16, the word meats. Meats is not a very difficult word, even if English is your second language. Again, it's more difficult if it is your second language, but still not, if you've been practicing for this test and you're scoring well and you're an international student, it's still not that hard to understand what the word meats means, especially if you're already going through this exam, right? So if we go to line 16, and it says meets the definition, right? It equates to, it reaches the threshold for the definition. We come back down here, right? And it's, right, does that all make sense, guys? Or same thing with the word promoted. I'm just, sorry guys, the reason I was pausing there is because I think we had, I don't remember if this was this passage or the final passage where there was an issue with the, there was an issue with a line number, but I don't think it's this one. But does that all make sense, guys? So if we see the word meets in line 16, it reaches a threshold, right? It doesn't encounter, it goes over the bar, if you will, right? It comes to where, so again, when you see fulfills, if we think about fulfilling, it's got to fulfill something. You fulfill a promise, you complete the promise, you get to the top of the promise, right? Those things are different than finds, joins, and encounters. And if you think about things like finds and encounters, those are synonyms, right? They're very closely related. So we can probably eliminate answer choices A and C because they're too closely related. It would be that's too simple of a word to try to separate what those definitions would be. Okay, yeah, and guys, if English is your first language, that's awesome, right? Of course, that's going to help you with the reading section. But again, the idea behind the science section is that you don't have to be nearly as worried. In my opinion, you don't have to be nearly as worried about about difficult vocabulary questions, and that's why it's my opinion that for every student, you should all be considered of the science passages. Does that all make sense, guys? Any questions on that? Any questions on that? Okay, any questions on that? Another thing that you'll commonly see on the science passages is something that, for those that have taken the ACT before, you see a lot of these less, more questions. Okay, and again, the reason that that's so critical is because if you say less, more, right? Immediately, that's almost like that's a very objective thought. That mathematically, right, for those students that are really good at math, if you look at these science passages, many times you can eliminate two answer choices just by making the first determination. And again, going back to, there's far fewer evidence-based or difficult evidence-based questions, okay, when you see these than you'd see on the history passages. Okay, there's far fewer evidence-based questions on these science passages, and there's far more questions that are very direct, right, according to the passage. It tells us exactly where we need to look, right? We have two vocabulary questions here. Okay, we have a few evidence-based questions, but we have according to figure 2, right? All of these according to figure 1. All of these question types are very direct, telling us exactly where we need to go, exactly where we need to look, and that's far more prominent on the two science passages than it is on the narrative passage or on the history passages. Anam, great question in terms of the figures. So let's talk about these. For those that have seen our previous videos, I am very, very, very adamant that you read the entire passage, that you thoroughly read the passage. And the reason I feel that way, thoroughly read, is because they give you enough time to do that. And because when you get to the questions, then there are always maybe half of the questions where you don't have to go back. So everybody's always worried about reading thoroughly, right? Reading the passage thoroughly because they're worried about losing that time. But I promise you, there's far less volatility. You won't have like the great test and then a bad test on the reading section if you thoroughly read. Because while you might run out of time with 5 questions to go, if you've thoroughly read, does everybody understand that if you thoroughly read this, thumbs up if you do, there's a far less like, oh, I'm going to freak out, right? Because if you read it, you know what's going on, and there's maybe 1 or 2 difficult questions per passage where even reading it doesn't help you that much, but all of the other questions can be very straightforward. And then do a NOMS question, right? So does everybody understand that? I highly, highly encourage you. You get plenty of time on the SAT reading section that when you see a passage, that you thoroughly read that passage. Okay, I'm a huge believer in that. This test section is called the reading section. It's not called the skim and go to the question section. It's not called the go to the question section and look back at a reading passage. It's called the reading section for a reason, and they want to see how well you comprehend. And when you do it that way, there's far less volatility in your score. You have to practice it maybe a little bit if you've been doing a different method, but I highly encourage you to do so. And then do a NOMS question. If you're going to thoroughly read the passage, do not thoroughly read the graphs. Do not. So there's 2 graph questions typically. Do not thoroughly analyze graphs until, right? This is a big until. Let me just underline that. Until. Okay, and everybody, I would highly recommend you guys take these notes until you get to graph questions. Okay, and the great thing about the SAT, okay, they're not trying to trick you. is that the graph questions almost always, they don't explicitly state this anywhere, but all of the graph questions will come at the end of a passage that has a graph. Can everybody give me 2 thumbs up if that makes sense? So graph questions come at the end of a graph passage. There's 2 graph passages on every SAT. Let me just say that again. 2 graph passages where they have graphs or figures at the end of the passage. 2 graph/figure passages on all SAT reading sections. At least, I think there's been 3 before, but there's at least 2. So when you get to the graph, they're always at the end. They don't explicitly say this. The SAT College Board hasn't given that in their directions, but it hasn't happened otherwise. So I would assume that that's going to happen on all future tests. Graph questions are at the end. And so my recommendation is that when you get to these graph questions, and these graph questions typically are not very difficult, right? For the most part, there's probably 1 difficult graph question. But if you know that these are at the end and you have read thoroughly, the difficult graph questions typically come up with the ones that say best made in the passage. Does everybody see that? So you should write this down, that there's typically 1 graph question rather, that relates directly to the passage. And this is the question that I would try to do last on these sections. Because what you get then is you'll see that these other questions, right? These other questions, according to figure 1, according to figure 2, those are very easy. And if you do this in the way that I want you to, right, you read passage. This is the order that you should approach these science graph question passages. Read passage, then passage questions, right? Then you go directly to the graph questions, so graph, or let's say easy graph questions. Easy graph questions, the ones that are asking you directly related to the graph, nothing to do with the passage. Easy graph questions, right? You circle things like according to figure 1 in groups with young pups, right? Circle the important words and then just go back and only focus on figure 1. Does everybody see that? That if you do this, if anybody's seen our ACT science videos, you'll know that it's a very similar approach. According to figure 1, right, approximately what proportion of prey is provided intact, right? So now we can go back and look at figure 1. If you do questions 29 and 31 first, you do the easy graph questions, then you complete the 1 passage graph question, right? As a final. There's only 1 of these typically. Passage graph question that relate the 2. And hopefully at this point you have a strong enough understanding about the passage because you read it and the graph questions because you've done a few of those to answer that difficult one, which in this case is number 30. So that would be the best way to approach it. And at least one of the science sections, sometimes it's both, at least one of the science passages is going to have a graph within that science passage. At least one. And sometimes it's both. Most of the time it's usually 1 history social science passage has the graph figure and 1 of the natural science passages has the graph of the figure. Okay? Does that all make sense, guys? Any questions about related to graph? Anand, does that answer your question if you're still watching for the live stream? Again, for anybody that's watching the recorded video, which is always available immediately after the live lesson, if you haven't had a chance to watch these, please make sure that you comment below with any questions or concerns, and one of our teachers or tutors will absolutely answer those questions for you. But just make sure that you comment in the comment section if you're not part of the live stream at any point. But, again, as a final note here, or as a continuing point, as we look at passage number 5 briefly for the October 2021 U.S. test, right? As we look at passage number 5, we see a similar theme in that the questions themselves are not particularly difficult. Okay? So if you're a student out there who asks questions within these live streams about how do I get a 1400 or whatever, the excuse of I just don't like reading these passages very much can't happen, because we got to know that if we do enjoy reading the passages, or if we convince ourselves to enjoy the passages, right, then the questions themselves are not very difficult. And again, one more thumbs up, guys, if you see that. We're now looking at passage number 5 from this same test, right? Passage 5, and just like on passage 3 from the October 2021 test, not many of us, or not many of you, there's a few, I know that a few are probably very interested in environmental studies, right? But not many of us have thought about phytoplankton and photosynthesizing microscopic organisms, right? Not very many of us have thought about that in a very concentrated way. And so, yes, this passage is going to be difficult to understand because we don't really know what the topic is. We don't really understand what the topic is just by nature, right? We haven't done enough research on this topic. But again, without thinking about that, if you read thoroughly through this passage, okay, it says, look at this, according to the passage, right? We get one right here, Grand's ideas about iron, right? About iron. So we're looking for the words Grand, right? And iron. And all of a sudden, we can immediately go back and find that if we don't remember it off the top of our heads. But generally speaking, there's only 90 lines of text. So it's not unheard of that you could just know that right off the top of your head if you read thoroughly. Number 45, right? Another question that relates directly back to the text with a line number, words in context. Number 48, according to the passage, right? The passage suggests it's a little bit more difficult, but here we have another one, right? According to the passage, or something that is directly related to the passage. And so again, 5 out of the 11 questions or so are these very, very direct questions, and that's why it's my opinion that for the vast majority of you watching this, you need to make sure that you include the science passages within your reading. I would say 90% of our students, and again, it's not every single one of them, but 90%, right? We will recommend that they always see passage 1, passage 3, and passage 5, right? That's the narrative. That in our opinion, after seeing enough students, right, and then the natural sciences, those are the easiest passages to complete. And I think the natural sciences overall are probably the easiest if you can get through the reading. And most students then save one of the history passages to complete at the end, so that if you do run out of time, at least, does that all make sense, guys, from a strategy perspective? If you do run out of time and you have 5 questions that you have to guess on at the end, at least those are the 5 questions that was already part of the hardest passage. So you're not doing easy questions at the end where you have to rush and guess when you shouldn't have to do that, because those are questions we need to make sure that we answer correctly. Again, I would say this is 90% with the other 2 passages, history and social science, being the ones that most students leave out. Now, that's not true for everybody. For me, that's not the case. I actually love passage 2 and passage 4, as I mentioned during that history video, the social science and history video. Those happen to be some of my favorite reads, so I've adjusted my own strategy, right? At this point, I've done enough of these that I can do 1 through 5 and know where I am, right? I know that if I'm on 2 or 1 and I'm taking longer, I'm going to make up that time. But that takes a lot of practice. If you're not at that point yet and you feel like you're running out of time on the final passage, make sure that final passage is one that you already know you don't love to do. And the only way to do that is to practice in the way that I suggested earlier, by doing each individual passage, okay, at a time. Set a stopwatch for yourself, okay? Set a stopwatch to see what your passage order should be at this time. Okay, set a stopwatch. Let me see if we can erase this. I'll end it on this note. But set a stopwatch for yourself and try to identify which of these passages is your best and which one is your worst. Okay, so if you notice, hey, I'm doing really well on passage 1, passage 3, passage 4, and passage 5 on 1 or 2 consecutive reading tests. Those have been my best passages. I've had a stopwatch. I've timed myself. I know exactly how much time it took and how accurate I was on each of those sections. Then that's the order that I'm going to commit to on my next full-length reading section or my next full practice test. And again, guys, if you do that, I promise you, I promise that your reading section score will go up. Because if this right here, hey, Bayram from Azerbaijan, welcome. Guys, I think again, I'm just commenting on the live chat there. Unbelievable where students are tuning in from. I think it's so cool. It's why we started creating this technology and getting these platforms ready to go for you guys. I think it's unbelievable that we can connect with students that are truly halfway around the world from me right now. Like if we drilled a hole through the center of the earth, we'd probably end up somewhere close to China or Azerbaijan. So welcome, guys. But again, as you guys look through this, I want everybody to commit to this idea, right, of finding the passages and finding your strategy. Because if this nets, right, if you add 5 additional questions by doing these passages in a different order, Okay, if you get 5 additional questions, well, on the reading section, guys, you just increased your score by 30 points without practicing at all. The only practice you had, right, where without practicing any new concepts or reading, right, the only new thing that you've done is you've identified which passages are your best, and I can almost guarantee that from an accuracy, from a timing standpoint, you will feel so much more comfortable with doing these passages in the order that you want to do them that you'll probably pick up 5 questions on your next reading test, which is equivalent on the reading section to roughly 30 points. And that only comes from flipping the page to the next passage and doing them in a different order. Okay, but like I said before, guys, I'd say 90% of our students, for the science purposes, 90% of our students should do the natural science passages, and you should just commit to, yes, these questions are very boring, or rather, yes, these passages are very boring, but I know that if I get through this reading and I understand it, just even from an overview, from a surface level, I know that the questions are going to be pretty straightforward and I'm going to be able to move through those relatively quickly. And especially true of the ones that have the graphs, because 2 of those graph questions on this particular test form, 29 and 31, are extremely straightforward and extremely easy. And then hopefully we can manage that kind of combo question between the graphs and the passage. All right, guys, so again, I'm trying to keep these tutorial videos on the reading passages to around 30 minutes. If you're ever interested, so I'm going to stop there. If you have any additional questions that were not answered during the live lesson, you can, of course, post those in the comments section below. If you're interested in our history and social science passage video, as well as the narrative passage video, you can find those in that SAT reading playlist that I posted. And that should also be posted, I think, in the video description below. If it's not, we'll have one of our teachers or teaching assistants post it after we're done with the live stream today. But again, guys, one final thing, please make sure that you subscribe to the channel. If you're interested in joining our membership program, you can absolutely do that by clicking join. You get basically 20 hours of SAT content taught by me all the way through, and you get personalized instruction with that, and you can read more about it if you click the join button. But at the very least, subscribe to the channel. That's 100% free. Please help us continue to spread the word about the channel. The more students that we get on the channel, the more of these videos we can make for free for you guys to digest and improve your scores. And then again, make sure that you download StarU, which is our tutoring platform. It has all of our content written by real SAT tutors. If you guys download that, you'll have access to 100 free lesson chapters and 500 free practice problems, all related to ACT and SAT testing. All right, guys. So I hope that was helpful today. That concludes our. Please make video fun. Yeah, we're going to move on to the writing sections between now and the December. That again, at the time of making this, the next test is in December, so we will move on and start looking at the writing section next. I don't know how much math we're going to do at this point. We'll do as much as we can, but we'll get through the writing section next, and hopefully we'll keep moving on. Hey, Ram, thanks for the nice comment there, nice compliment. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate all of your participation. I hope you guys are enjoying these videos and getting a lot out of them. Again, please help us spread the word, and please make sure that you download StarU to get access to that free content. We're trying to get as much away as we possibly can, and again, the more viewers, the more you guys are able to help us spread the word, the more of these free items and content that we can produce. So, again, guys, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Good luck studying. If you have any questions, comment below. Otherwise, good luck as you continue to prepare for this test, and look out for our next live streams. Make sure you turn on all notifications if you are subscribed, so that you know when the next live lesson, you'll get a reminder, a notification.